Right, I thought, while we're loading stuff up, I thought I'd say hello. My name's Graham Hambley, I'm the editor of PQ Magazine, and with the Shani and Queen Mary University of London, we do these wonderful seminars.
Correct.
Award-winning seminars now. And we've done one on the future of tax, we've done one on the future of audit, and now we're doing one on the future is net zero. And for me, it's always been a big issue. I've got proof. It doesn't go back a long way. We tried to say accountants will save the planet in 2019. It's a seminar we ran, and we had a fantastic academic. If you ever get the chance to read what Professor Jill Atkins has to say about the planet and where we're going, it's really worth some of your time. She says it's all about the bees. If we don't keep the bees alive, then we have no food. The insects are the most important people on this important insects on this planet, not people. So if we don't keep them alive, then we are going to be next. And she said that nature is really important. It's time for us to start accounting for nature and looking at how that works. And accountants, that's what you do. You account for things, and you've forgotten, or perhaps the educators have forgotten to tell you that to look after the world. There's no point looking after the money, because when the world ends, everyone will be going the same way. So we need to look at how we're going to save the planet, and accountants have to be at the forefront of that. There's really great stuff in this magazine. I don't know what it's called. It's called PQ Magazine. This is one I made earlier. We made it. You can see how I make them. It's terrible. I am actually cleaning the planet, aren't I? So I print it off and we changed. But the guy whose picture I've taken off that lead story is Professor Ian Thomas, who works at the University of Birmingham. He's changed their complete syllabus, their accounting syllabus, so it's completely green. And every single accountancy degree has to have that running through their curriculum. So you need to be able to measure carbon, you need to be able to measure how whatever you do, anything you do affects the planet. And that's great for accountants because they want you to do that and measure that. So it's a great opportunity, and we're going to be hearing someone from PwC who can tell you it's a great career to have. It will give you such wonderful opportunities, and it's great to be, if you're going to go out and tell people. I always remember we used to do stories about people who say, so do you ever lie about what you do as a profession? I'm a journalist, so I have to lie all the time, but sort of, and there's teachers and there's university lecturers, but when you go to a party, do you tell everyone you're an accountant? And people used to be embarrassed about that. Well, I think you shouldn't be. I think you should be, there'll be a time when they say, oh yeah, you're the people who are saving the planet. That's what we want. So, and I think, I know I'm being facetious about it, but I'm not actually. I think you can. And I think it's really important that you do. There's lots of, in micro levels, it's always interesting. We've got someone here from CASL today, which is Chartered Accountants Student Society of London, which is all the ICAW students in London. We've sort of got this fantastic group of people looking after them, students who make sure that they're okay. And they've got exams, they've got the final exams in July and November, and any accountant will tell you that doesn't quite add up. If you look at the whole year, the exams are 4 months apart and 8 months apart. So why would that be? And I think it's a good thing. They've always done it that way. And students said, well, hey, why can't we sit them in May? It's hard, if we're doing remote exams and I'm sitting them at home. I actually think this room's quite hot, isn't it? It's sort of be nice, if we could sit in May. And then there's 6 months between my next exams rather than 4 and 8. And it seems like no one's looked at that, but that's the climate actually having an effect on ICAW exams. So even on that micro level, it can have really important implications. The only other thing I was looking at is here, so I always, every time I seem to bring up CTAM, and this is today's CTAM. And on the front cover of the City AM is a whole thing about Shell and greenwashing. I actually personally think that the advertising watchdog is actually being a bit tough on Shell. It's trying to show some of its green credentials, but they're saying they can't show any of them because they have petrol and they have gas, and so they can't even talk about anything else. And I think it's a bit mean. And they did the same thing to HSBC as well. And I think companies need to be allowed a little bit of freedom to actually express themselves about how they want to change and try and be greener. So the greenwashing thing's always going to be hanging over companies and hanging over what they do, but what they need is a good set of accountants who can show that they are. But you're not here to hear me talk. We're just trying to say that we, as a student publication, we've always been really interested and always been pushing the green agenda. And sometimes against, we feel that it hasn't really been, that people are pushing back on it, and we're not really quite sure why. But I think it's changed, and it's changed mainly because some of the professional bodies have actually stepped up and doing so much better now. But if you looked at them 10 years ago, they weren't doing anything at all particularly. That's me, that's PQ Magazine. Thank you so much for being here. Hopefully you love the lineup. I'm going to hand you quickly to Shani, and then I'm going to introduce our first guest.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you for that, Graham. Welcome to Queen Mary, University of London. And those who are new to the panels, this is our third round, and I feel really amazing and wonderful to see that it's growing. We started small, it's growing and bigger, and lots of audience today. It's so great. In the previous panels, I really didn't went into who we are. So I'm Ishani, and I run the PwC, in partnership with PwC BSc Accountancy program, our smallest program. And that program runs 4 years. It's housed at Queen Mary. And students, those who join this program are just over there. And they're the future. Future is here. Future is now, and ready to take over all the challenges. And they are here for 4 years. And by the time they graduate, they would have been completed 80% of the ICAW papers. So they'll go from certificate level to diploma level, and the case studies where they will be doing when they join PwC in the first contract. So that's their journey. This is amazing. So this is the group of us who's leading, but everyone is really curious and excited to bring more in ESG to our curriculum. So UG, PG, all of them. So how many students have we got? UG, we've got 250 students. That not just the PwC partnership program, but also we have other program students joining Big Four to the small firms, NHS, public finance as well. So PG, how many students we have?
About, in our department, probably about...
In our department, yes. In our department, yes, we've got around just short of 200.
200.
And we have a
PhD doctoral program as well we have, and everyone is interested in, but as you all know that we've got to kind of embed the employability, etc. into our curriculum. So that's why we are here to network with you, and we would really love to welcome your thoughts, your ideas, and please join us. So there might, if there's not a place like this to talk, but we could also individually invite to our programs to give a talk, partner with us, get placements, inside days, all kind of sorts of things. That's why our students are keen as well to get in. So please, you all a big welcome, and after the event as well, network. So let's make a start, because we have a really great, good group of panel here, excited waiting. But before I forget, thank you very much for all the people who are supporting logistics. We forgot, but most of all, Stuart, who's really supporting us, one of our professional staff, and really helping me with this panel series, organizing, and all of the rest. So thank you.
Thank you, Shani. I'd like to quickly thank our sponsors, which are Rogo, Intech, SITFA, GapWeb, Net Zero Now, AAT, and ICAW. And when we asked them, are you interested in this subject, they all had to say yes, of course. So it's great that they came on board. Without further ado, let's see how accountants can help save the planet.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you for rebranding the accountants as well. We really needed that. Hi, everyone. My name is Gökçen Cesur, I work in PwC as a stakeholder ESG assurance manager. And although I'm an accounting major and started my career as a financial auditor. So when people ask me, what is it that you do? And I say, I'm in sustainability and climate change, they can't help but wonder, how on earth did an accountant end up in such a noble cause? It is a valid question, and I'm happy to provide an answer with that. But first, let's talk about an important concept, carbon budget, and its relevance to achieving net zero targets. To understand the concept of a carbon budget, let's imagine our climate as your phone filled with photos and videos. Over the past 2 centuries, since widespread fossil fuel consumption began, your phone or your cloud account has been steadily gathering historical emissions. Each year, as we continue to emit carbon, we add more photos and videos to our phone, filling up the cloud storage. The tipping point occurs when the cloud storage reaches a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which scientists warn would have serious consequences. The number of photos we can still add to our phone without it becoming full represents our carbon budget. In other words, it indicates the remaining carbon emissions we can release before reaching the 1.5 degree limit. Now we can talk about how accountants and auditors can help with that. Carbon accountants play a similar role to financial accountants, helping track carbon emissions, analyzing the impact, and ensuring transparency in reporting. By incorporation carbon accounting into the decision-making process, individuals, companies, investors, and governments can make informed choices to reduce their carbon emissions. As more investors, employees, and customers prioritize climate transparency and choose greener options, the flow of money and resources would increasingly support sustainable practices. Also, it is safe to say, as accountants and auditors, we are experts in reporting. We have been proficient in measurement, accounting, and disclosure, or our expertise naturally aligns with the principles embedded within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which incorporates various accounting principles. As auditors, we have a long-standing history of verifying financial and non-financial information. And by doing that, we add trust and credibility to the market. Finally, accountants and auditors have the potential to drive change on a daily basis. We already play a role in global governance through international financial reporting standards. So now let's talk more specifically about my role in verifying ESG green claims. What I do, I audit companies' green claims. So I prevent greenwashing. I hold corporates accountable on their ESG net zero commitments and targets. Our scope typically is the most material metrics considered key metrics for companies, which is primarily greenhouse gas emissions, but our scope has expanded to broader ESG metrics. For example, in one of my clients, Diageo, we are looking at more than just carbon emissions, but we're looking at their water efficiency metrics as well. So it's not that dissimilar to financial audit. We are applying assurance fundamentals to a different subject matter. I guess the final important point to note is mandatory ESG assurance is coming. And as PwC, we are hiring tens and thousands in the coming year globally to respond to this challenge. So calling out all accounting majors here, this is going to be the future to stay relevant. Now let's talk about the relationships between the climate and business, which is undeniable and can be understood from various risk perspectives. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but here are 4 key aspects to consider. Physical risks. These risks can include increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events such as hurricanes and floods, rising sea levels, heat waves. These events can disrupt supply chains, damage infrastructure, lead to increased insurance costs, and cause business interruptions. Transition risks can arise from the process of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. Businesses may face regulatory changes, shifts in consumer preferences, and technological advancements. These changes can lead to stranded assets, for example, fossil fuel reserves becoming uneconomical and reduced market demand for products or services that are not aligned with sustainability goals. Third one is changes in the market. So these are the changes coming from all of you, basically. As awareness of climate change grows, consumers are increasingly seeking environmentally sustainable products and services. Businesses that fail to adapt and meet these preferences may experience decreased demand and loss of market share. Finally, reputational risks. Expectations from all of you, investors, customers, employees, are shifting towards environmental responsibility. To mitigate reputational risks, businesses should prioritize sustainability, adopt sustainable practices, set clear environmental goals. So, despite the progress made in carbon accounting, there are still challenges to overcome. The field of carbon accounting needs to mature and establish streamlined rules and processes similar to financial accounting. Additionally, more companies need to disclose their carbon footprints, and the domino effects to disclosure needs need to continue, with larger companies encouraging smaller companies to follow, or else, as I like to call, peer pressure. The presence of multiple sustainability and climate-related standards makes it difficult for stakeholders and investors to compare and evaluate organizations effectively. We call it the alphabet soup of the standards. Let's talk about only a couple of them that you've seen here. The Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, are 2 widely recognized frameworks that provide guidance for corporate reporting on sustainability and climate-related matters. GRI is primarily targeted at a wide range of stakeholders. This includes investors, customers, employees, communities. So its audience is interested in understanding the overall sustainability performance and impacts of an organization. Whereas TCFD is primarily aimed at the financial community, including investors, lenders, and insurers. Its audience is interested in evaluating the financial implications of climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as IFRS sustainability reporting. So the audience seeks consistent and comparable information to incorporate sustainability considerations into their investment decisions and financial analysis. Now, let's talk about where PwC at in all of this. Broadly speaking, we've been working across 3 main pillars. First one would be transitioning our own business, sharing our own experience with other businesses and organizations. We've made a global science-based commitment to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Our total annual emissions have decreased by 37% compared to our FY19 baseline. We focused on maintaining this progress as our business adapts after the pandemic. 90% of our electricity we use has come from renewable resources. We will also counterbalance our emissions through high-quality carbon offsetting projects, including natural climate solutions. From FY30, we will transition our portfolio to carbon removals. We will choose projects based on quality and verification of the carbon reduction impacts and for their economic and social benefits. Second pillar is supporting our clients in their transition to a low-carbon world through consulting and auditing. In consulting space, we help clients manage their impact on the climate through net zero transformation. We help clients accelerate their path to net zero, map their carbon footprints, scope 1, 2, 3, and create practical strategies to decarbonize, including clear roadmaps and metrics. We support clients to apply the methodology in TCFD and any other sustainability frameworks. We help clients manage climate risk and build resilience. In our audit practice, we assess and challenge climate risk, whether it is considered material and its potential impact on the financial statements during audits. We audit their carbon credentials, greenhouse gas emissions, progress versus baseline, but we also do other climate-related metrics as well. The final pillar is engaging in the global climate policy debate and advocating for change, including our focus on reporting and transparency frameworks. Actively participating in the conversation, we continue to advocate for globally aligned sustainability reporting standards. Our leaders vigorously support the development of baseline global sustainability reporting standards. We continue to make contributions across the wider climate policy agenda through our strategic global partnerships and alliances. For example, the World Economic Forum and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Before I close off, I want to make a call for action. Please keep questioning. What else can we do as individuals? We need for collective efforts to influence elected representatives, businesses, clients, and suppliers to calculate, understand, and set targets for carbon reduction. We need to make conscious choices, like opting for a more plant-based diet, switching to renewable energy contracts, shopping second-hand clothes, cycling instead of driving. So going back to my very first point, when people ask me as an accountant, can you really help with climate change? I say, yes, absolutely I can. Accountants possess the ability to tackle climate change and potentially save the world. Some may consider this claim unconventional, but I genuinely believe that accountants can passionately champion the fight against climate change and achieve net zero. Thank you.
Mark Williams from SIPFA, and hopefully in 15 minutes, I think I've got about 15 minutes, haven't I? Chance to take some questions, but also maybe to change your mind, because of course, remember, the public sector is there because there are market failures. So net zero will not happen without the public sector. The private sector will not do this in and of themselves. That's why the public sector is quite important in this. So yeah, my name's Mark Williams. I've been doing this for a very long time. I joined SIPFA at the start of last year, and I sit in their consulting business, so I do various consulting projects. But also they keep me busy across policy and technical, so I write some guidance, and delivering training as well. So before joining SIPFA, senior roles, one of the big four, I was a partner at Deloitte, and one of the consultancies, also some time in Cabinet Office and in Treasury. So I've been around a bit. I am an accountant. Actually, I'm Institute of Chartered Accountants and SIPFA qualified, so dual qualified. And but over time, I've expanded out from accounting into projects and commercial skills and property and infrastructure, because of course consultants have to be agile in what they do. In terms of what CIPFA's up to, we're very busy in the sustainability space. We've got various training offers, micro modules free to download on the website. We're doing something with the Institute of Chartered Accountants around sustainability certificates. I run some green finance training for public bodies a couple of times a year with a stellar list of speakers. So there's a lot going on. Plus, we've got some consulting projects in this space as well. So, I'm going to move my slides. You've heard about this already. Scope 1, 2 and 3. Obviously, Scope 3 is a difficult one to measure. It's about your supply chain. It's about your embodied carbon and so forth. So that's quite tricky. As it says bottom right, carbon is a new currency. So carbon is a new currency. And of course, if you see it as a new currency, measurement and data is very important. Reporting is very important. And it means finance professionals have a key role to play if you see carbon as a new currency. But of course, as you'll hear from me as we go through, measurement and reporting is not enough, because measurement and reporting will get you where you are today. Obviously, we have a role as accountants and other professions to move things along in order to achieve the net zero ambitions. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the actual projects that I've been involved in over the last decade, 15 years or so. Also, I can link it into broader, I suppose, socio-economic benefits. Are people familiar with the UN Sustainability Development Goals, the SDGs, the 17 goals? Obviously, some of those are net zero related, but this is much broader. And indeed, I think it is useful to link it into that concept. Role of public services, I said already, key role, because there's a market failure here. They've got to play a role. But of course, they have many roles. So you heard from PwC about investors. Well, actually, in my world, some public bodies have very deep pockets and make lots of investments. I was involved in setting up the Green Investment Bank way back. So they act as an investor. They also, of course, act as a buyer. They buy things from the private sector, the voluntary sector. And as it says on the slide, they buy about £300 billion a year of goods and services from the private and the voluntary sector. So even if you're not working in the public sector, the chances are you'll end up working with the public sector, because £300 billion a year is a lot of money. And of course, that gives you buying power. You can do things like PPN 0621 that says you must give us our net zero statements or your net zero statements in order to win work from us. So it's using the buying power that public sector have in order to address that market failure, in order to get the private sector to do what you want. Does that make sense? Anybody who's done a tender recently will know that probably half a tender submission these days is all about SDGs and ESG and net zero and you name it. There's a lot to be leveraged from the private and voluntary sector by government procurement. Projects. I like to talk about specific projects because I'm a simple soul, and rather than sort of theoretical concepts, talking about things that I've been involved in, makes life perhaps more straightforward. So I was involved in the work of the Glasgow City region in terms of how do you retrofit 1 million homes. And thankfully, we published just ahead of COP26, which was quite convenient for them in terms of talking about the commercial ask, the financial ask, what they wanted from the supply chain, what they wanted from education institutions, from big suppliers, etc. And interestingly, as I say, all these things are linked. First question the leader asked up in Glasgow was, how many jobs will this create in the region? Because there's a big economic stimulus angle here, beyond carbon and net zero. I was fortunate enough to be the funding and finance advisor on the Mayor of London's energy efficiency programmes, very part-time, but almost a decade. And again, it's highlighting that lots is happening out there. So let's take the Workplaces programme. That has retrofitted energy efficiency measures in 1,000 public buildings across London, done through 300 projects, quickest one done in 10 weeks, from somebody saying, I want to do some energy efficiency measures on a building like this, to someone signing a contract with one of the project and programme framework contractors using the advisors that had been appointed by the Mayor. So it's been really successful, and it's actually survived 3 mayors so far. including one that described it as fitting energy-busting gizmos to public buildings. I'll let you guess which former Mayor of London used that language. And we've got a picture there. That's St Helier Hospital, for people who recognise that. So that had 1970s steam-powered boilers that had to be maintained by steam enthusiasts, and single-glazed 1930s windows before we came along and did the work under the Mayor of London's programme. And again, carbon, obviously very important, net zero very important. But can you imagine a clinical setting, working in a clinical setting or being treated in a clinical setting where they've got single-glazed windows from the 30s and steam pad boilers from the 70s? You know, there's a whole reason for doing this well beyond sort of carbon and net zero. Equally, there's a homes element to the Mayor's programme, and they have teamed up with an outfit called Energy Sprong, who are, of course, Dutch. And there you've got a line of houses that have had deep retrofit done to them, getting them close to net zero. So it's had, you know, wrapping on the outside, solar on the roof, heat pumps at the back, lots and lots of control systems and so forth, and that's great. But as always, as accountants, we need to look at the detail, and the devil is in the detail. That's the one that was subject to right to buy. So the private sector owner of that row of sort of social houses obviously wasn't able to pay the $80,000 themselves to have the works done. So, you know, again, bit of a market failure in that the social housing units were done, but the one in the middle, the right to buy one, didn't get it done. So we need to work around that. Lots of councils involved in commercialisation, and obviously some of that's now coming home to roost a bit. Some of that commercialisation has not gone well, and I know we've got a Woking council taxpayer in the room, so yeah, your council tax will be going up, given that they've lost almost £2 billion. But, you know, care is needed, so they can act as investors, they can act as catalysts, they can act as sort of solving market failures. But there's risk attached to that. Care is needed, and that's the point here around, you know, this is complex, risky programs and projects, lots of commercial arrangements, lots of financing arrangements, lots of money. There's a wall of money out there that wants to invest in this sort of stuff. Finance professionals have a role to make sure that we're not doing things that will fall over. So again, in terms of progressing those programs and projects, finance have a role. That links to my next point, which is I've worked for City Council as well on a distressed solar project turnaround. So there's been a number of these, and this was one where they put solar panels on the roof at 5,000 council houses. They didn't do any LED lighting, they didn't do any insulation on the houses, they didn't do anything else, they just sort of rented the roof space. And that's quite difficult, it's quite risky, it's a bit like the Wild West. And not this council, but there are some NHS bodies out there that have signed deals to rent their roof space for 25 years without thinking about the roof has only got a useful economic life left of 10 years, so they've got some problems that they're having to unpick. So again, accountants challenging being in the detail in such as, you know, do we actually have the ability to put the solar on the roof? Does the roof have the life of it? Do we actually own the building we're planning to put the solar on the roof of, etc.? I think one of the best examples of net zero reporting is National Highways, who I helped a couple of years ago, and their publication, their net zero strategy, all available online, quite interactive. They've been very clever in terms of sort of really drilling down into their sort of carbon KPIs and so forth, and they've got a 2030 target, they've got a 2040 target, and a 2050 target. Is quite difficult for an organisation that runs motorways and pours concrete, but at least they have an ambition to get them there. 2030 includes the fact they want to plant 3 million trees to offset. The good news is they actually have the land to plant 3 million trees on. There's some local authorities I work with who sort of say those sorts of things, and then you ask where, and they say, well, actually, we haven't got the land after all. So our net zero announcements from the politicians a bit more tricky. Trees are important. So again, recent work I did, public inquiry on Sheffield highways, public domain report, it's all out there. They encouraged their private sector partner to chop down thousands of trees because that made the highways maintenance perhaps more straightforward. But because this was written, the contract was written, the business case was written in a period before people sort of valued natural capital in the way that they do now, they sort of overlooked this, whereas obviously now there's been massive outcry when councils chop down trees. So some of that work for Sheffield was about ensuring they knew how to value natural capital, they knew how to sort of play in the socio-economic benefits. MOD's done a lot in this space, and I've done some interesting things with the MOD. They've got a massive estate, as you know. They've got a good net zero strategy out there. Again, it's quite difficult, given what they do ultimately, to become net zero, but they're working hard to try and move the estate along. They've also figured out that this is a good way of recruiting and retaining people. If you sort of express the fact that these are areas that they're working on the SDGs. What else we got? Santander, that's an interesting one, partly because it highlights that it's not about the money, odd thing for an accountant to say, but Santander have signed a deal with GE Lighting that sees GE Lighting providing lighting as a service in their 800 Santander branches, and GE Lighting provide the finance. Now, did Santander need the money? No, they didn't need the money, they're a bank. The reason why they got GE Lighting to provide the money is the commercial incentive that comes from saying, you're going to run this as a service, you're going to take risk, and by the way, it's your money that's on the line. So that's why GE Lighting run it as a service and have the money in there. And then finally, lots of grants around, as people may know, BEIS, as was now Department for Energy, have pushed out billions and billions of grants recently, fortunately through the Mayor's programme. We got about 250 million of the billions for projects in London, but there's a steady flow of grant money. All of this needs some structure. And the final thing I'm going to talk about, as I always do, because I do a lot of business case training, indeed I led the training work stream on the Green Book Review for HM Treasury, is using a business case structure. So public sector shouldn't do anything without having a business case, a sort of well-formed decision-making framework, making sure that whatever they want to do fits in with the strategic objectives, the policy. And for net zero, that's quite straightforward because it's in legislation. You need to act. And obviously, lots of people have said 2030, if we're going to be net zero. So strategic concept or context is easy. Economic case, it's all about socio-economic benefits. Public bodies do not do things for a profit motive, for a finance motive. They do it because of economic, socio-economic benefits. So the options are appraised against social value, whatever you call it, sort of socio-economic benefits. Then with our preferred option, we need to think about how we're going to do the handshake with the market, because the public sector can't deliver this all themselves. They need to engage with the market. And in some cases, that may be a complex commercial model, passing risk to the private sector. Can we afford it? How are we going to pay for it? And can we manage it? Which again is a very important question. Don't sign up to a deal. Don't build something if you can't then manage it and operate it. So, so that's the decision-making framework that public bodies should follow. Economic case, as people may know, is supported by the Green Book, which I do think is the Bible in terms of measuring socio-economic benefits, the Bible in terms of measuring SDGs and anything else like that. Are people familiar with the Green Book? It made the tabloid press even in 2020 in the context of levelling up. Worth Googling Green Book, because as I say, this is the rules of the road for the economists, and as I say, most things in public sector are done for socio-economic reasons, and then finance needs to sort of fall in behind, arguably. So worth sort of Googling the Green Book. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'm very happy to take any questions. Yeah, no, great question. I mean, hopefully aviation in the long term will get there. There's obviously loads of work going on around that. And again, that's obviously the aircraft. There's all sorts of other parts of the aviation industry, having done work at Schiphol and Gatwick and what have you over the years. The answer, I think, is it has to be fixed because, we need to bring some rigour and robustness to that because, as you say, there's some areas that just can't get there. So we have got to offset by overperforming elsewhere. And again, public sector have a role to play. I work with various authorities who would now say, do you want to buy some of our offsets? Because they're busy planting trees and doing all sorts of things so they can actually be a seller of offsets. And again, people don't necessarily see the public sector in that role, but there are councils out there doing that. So I think offset has got a role. It has to be more robust and more rigorous and more transparent. Interestingly, in Scotland, offsetting for public sector bodies at least has been sort of not outlawed, but they can't score on the basis of offsetting. Whereas in London, I'm working with a London borough who's got very deep pockets. They do still exist. And they're like, yeah, we'll get to 2030, no problem. We just got to buy loads of offsets. It's fine. I'm like, that's not how this is supposed to work, because obviously you buying offsets crowds them out for someone else, and it would be better if they did, and they can, genuinely work towards net zero. Does that make sense? I think the answer is yes, but as always, with most things I do, including this agenda, it's got to be multidisciplinary. You can't rely solely on the accountants. You've got to have some other disciplines along. Also, we can do it where it's transparent and honest. There obviously is a limit if people are trying to game it entirely and if it's all greenwash. And, there is a limit to what we can sort of assure if they're trying to game it, partly because this, of course, is a global story as well, isn't it? And, very difficult to sort of, I suppose, audit your UK company if they're buying their offsets and their carbon credits, somewhere else in the world. So if people are open and honest, I think we can, but the gaming side of it makes it quite tricky. Yeah, there was obviously real advantages of working in the public sector, including because of complexity. I remember auditing Royal Marsden a very, very long time ago, and on the board was the finance director of one of the investment banks, so big name. And he said, this is really complicated, actually, your business. It's far more complicated than an investment bank. So if you're drawn to complexity, as well as public services is quite a good place to be.
Hi. Well, thanks for inviting me along, Graham, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm Adam Williamson, Head of Responsible Business and Policy at AAT. Can I just say, actually, you're talking about carbon offsetting and the credit and brokering. I think one of the problems as well is we keep looking at trees and flowers and things like that, which have a place, and carbon capture. But I would say a large problem with climate change is inequality. And actually, a lot of those resources ought to be being put into building infrastructures and more equality in places in the world that are going to be most affected by climate change. But that's just a personal bugbear. If you're not familiar with AAT, we are the Association of Accounting Technicians. We are the world's leading professional body for accounting technicians. We've got around 50,000 full members, mostly in the UK, but we do have presence elsewhere in the world, particularly in Botswana and Myanmar, for historical reasons. And we have about 8,000 of those, 6,000 of those members are licensed, so they are they are assessed by us as qualified to provide services direct to the public. And we're a qualifications provider, so we have around 70,000 students currently studying our qualifications. I wanted to talk just a little bit about where we're coming from, what we do. And earlier this year, AAT launched our corporate strategy to 2030. Now, I think that's the first time we've ever sort of created a strategy that's that far forward thinking. Actually, it's only 6 years away now. It was about 10 years when we started it. And that's got three key strands, which I was talked about, but all of them, I hope you'll see, have a link to the sustainability agenda. So the first is around keeping our profession relevant. Accountants play a really vital role in these times of change. We're supporting businesses. I say we, I'm not an accountant, but it's the royal we. They play an important role in supporting businesses and economies at all levels. So whether that's local, whether that's national or global. But there is a really growing expectation that accountants have to adapt. This is not the traditional profession of old, if you like. They need to become more digital. They need to become more data and insight led. And they need to be more focused on sustainable growth and more aware of ethical considerations, helping their businesses to balance that profit and purpose bottom line. And the second part of it is around driving up professional standards. This is something that's very close to my heart. I used to be head of professional standards at another professional body, the RIBA, and I was previously head of professional standards at AAT as well. So I've always felt that this is a really, really key part, obviously, of any professional body, but it's also about building trust. It's how we interact as professions with the public. And so that's the ultimate impact we're looking for as an organisation, is to seek that greater trust and the confidence in the profession by the public. And the third is building responsible business. That's the third strand of the strategy. As far as we're concerned, AAT has a very clear remit to act in the public interest. We are a charity, a not-for-profit organisation, and actually in our very articles of association, that in our creation, as it were, as a body acting in the public interest is there front and centre. Actually, Graham mentioned, how professional bodies have changed over the years and become more involved in these things. Even responsible business was not a phrase that we used at all when I joined 6 years ago. Now it's one of 3 main strands in our strategy, and I'm lucky enough to have it in my job title. So clearly it's something that has now come to the fore. So we're making moves in those directions. And we truly believe that as a professional membership organisation, we can enact and we can inspire real societal change. And that's both through our own business activities, but also, really importantly, demonstrating leadership to our communities. And that responsible business activity for us, internally as it were, is based around what I call the 4 Ps. So that's purpose, people, planet, and practices. Now, all of those are, very clearly inextricably linked. In terms of what we've done as an organisation recently to try and help with the sustainability agenda, one of the main actions we took recently is that we moved office. Our office lease was coming up for renewal relatively recently. Clearly, we'd been through the pandemic. Things were changing. We knew that remote working was undoubtedly here to stay. Not everybody felt that was the case, but we said, no, we're pretty sure that we're going to be changing our working models. So what do we do about our footprint? And we thought, well, here's an opportunity to really reduce it. But also, if we're going out there, we can really change the normal criteria, if you like, about what we're looking for from an office. And very top of that list was, we want something that is really highly sustainable. So as a result of that, we are now based in Canary Wharf. Really annoying, because it's put 3 miles on my bike ride. But luckily, remote working, I'm not having to be in there every day. But this is, as I say, it's a building that has a much greater emphasis on sustainability. It's a building that has 100% renewable energy. It allows us to do our own energy metering, has a zero plastic policy. It has a zero waste to landfill and recycling policy. Chemical-free cleaning. It has grey water systems. So it's also, the building itself was built to very high sustainability standards. So actually, in one fell swoop, we've actually made a huge difference to our carbon footprint just by moving office. And a second thing is David, I'm not sure where he is, but we'll be talking to you later. Oh, there he is. Hi, David. We've just signed up to use the Net Zero Now platform. So we'll be engaging with that. So that is something that will allow us to get a much closer grip on our greenhouse gas emissions, will allow us to explore our scope 1 to 3 activity, our supply chains in a much more meaningful way, and also therefore to help us create some real meaningful targets that we can report on. So that's something just about what we have been doing, and we're trying to, as I said, show that leadership. We are also carbon neutral, and I confess that some of that is offsetting. When we first did it, actually, to be clear, when we first did it, it was very much around buying some trees. And that did what we needed to do. It was the first time we'd entered into that kind of zone. We didn't know much about it. But then after a while, we thought, well, they're coming up for renewal. What do we want to do next in terms of offsetting? And that allowed us to really sit down and go, well, what's material to us as an organisation? And actually, we thought about, there are only so many things on the market, so you have to go out and look and what projects, are available and that you can invest in. But we actually chose one. I mentioned Myanmar. We ended up choosing one there. Why? Because we have a presence there. So we felt that was something that was directly related to us. But also it was about people. It wasn't just about planting trees. This was about, it was to do with cook stoves. I can tell you more about the detail if you want at some point. But we felt it was far more tangible. It was far more relevant to us as an organisation rather than just, look, we're carbon neutral. We're carbon neutral because. I think that's really important. But anyway, back to the title of this session. We talked about accountants will save the world. This was a quote from a guy called Peter Backer, who was president of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He told a conference that back in 2012 in Rio de Janeiro. I suppose the question is, well, why did he say that? And I think it's because accountants have the skills. And our colleagues from PwC was alluding to that already. The skills are already there. It's built into the training that accountants have for the net zero agenda. It's about measurement. It's about reporting. It's about assurance. Now, I'm not going to go too much detail. I'm pretty sure Sarah is going to talk a little bit about that in more detail afterwards. I don't want to steal too much of her thunder. And therefore, there's an obvious reason why it's in the syllabus. It's certainly in the AAT syllabus. And we've just recently this year launched our latest suite of qualifications, the Q22. And very, very prevalent in that and very clear in that are ethics and sustainability. Now, they've always been there. This is not something brand new, but it is something that is being far more sort of under the spotlight in these latest iterations. And I talked to somebody actually from a training provider this week who's obviously involved in delivering those qualifications. I was just trying to get a feel from her, what's the sort of reaction to this. And she said that they've already seen that sustainability elements are coming out really strongly in terms of assessment results. In fact, by far and away, the most successful part of all of the modules is around sustainability, which I think is fantastic, obviously, and I think it really represents that there's not only understanding, but real engagement in that part of the syllabus. And one of the reasons she believes that's the case, and the feedback she's getting, is that sustainability within accountancy has become much more relatable. Students are increasingly seeing how sustainability is going to relate to what they will be doing. It's not a sidebar, it's not something slightly esoteric, or it's not something that I really care about, but nobody else does. I very much support the kind of idea that every job is a green job. Everybody should have an element of sustainability built into their roles. We're not there yet. And drive at AAT by ensuring that all staff have roles that directly support the overall strategy, and that overall strategy has elements of sustainability running all the way through it. Now, that should sound really obvious and a bit of a no-brainer, but you could go into a hell of a lot of organisations and look at job descriptions and look at objectives and try and marry them back to that top level, and you'll find it quite often there are lots of gaps in between. And she also expressed a really interesting view around the triple bottom line. And she said that generally the students understand the planet and the people stuff really well, but actually they struggle a bit more with the profit, which gives a suggestion that sustainability is still a little bit viewed through that sort of lens of ethics and morals rather than commerce. And I think that's something that we still need to really work on as accountancy bodies and qualifications providers to make sure that it's clear that circle, and hopefully a virtuous circle, is really clear and really full. And And of course, as it's been alluded to already, there are also loads of free resources out there. We have produced some. We are working with ICAW on some, and no doubt again Sarah will talk about some of those. And we also introduced new CPD pathways. So all new members of AAT now have to undertake a compulsory CPD pathway, which does include, for the first time, sustainability elements, which are mandatory. I suppose the question is, well, why? Why are we producing all these resources? Why have we built it into the syllabus? Why is it so important for our members? And I would say there are 4 key answers to that. And the first being, well, because you've got to do it. It's no longer a nice to have. It's no longer something, well, I care about it. We've had some little talk already about the regulations. There are regulations already in effect. I mean, a really good example is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That's going to completely transform ESG reporting. That starts from next year. So the reports will be due in 2025 for anybody with their sort of business reporting year ending 31st of December 24. So, I mean, that's potentially around 50,000 companies that are going to be subject to that. So that's enormous. And that includes, not only companies based in EU, but companies that have a presence, even if they're more global. And that's gonna bring in the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which is going to require reporting on hundreds of metrics and targets. And so basically that means that accurate information is going to be required from every single part of the organisation to be able to produce that reporting. And quite clearly, well, who's going to do that? Well, teams full of people like you, hopefully, who have the expertise, have the knowledge to be able to provide that information. I say a lot has been made about the assurance aspects of this. A lot of being made of that by the big audit firms, perhaps not surprisingly. But that information has got to come from somewhere in the first place. There's no point in giving assurance to information that doesn't exist. So where is it coming from? And I said that's where the people in the finance teams and the ESG teams are going to come into their own. There will also be 2 new global baseline standards coming out from the ISSB this year. Again, not going to go into this too much because I know Sarah, who knows much more about the measurement and reporting stuff than I do, will be talking about that. But of course, it's also it's interesting that we seem to have gone from no standards to quite a number of standards, all in a very short period of time. And that could be an issue in itself because we need to know that there's interoperability, that they're going to be consistent. What we don't want is certain areas of the world or certain jurisdictions to saying, oh, actually, that one kind of suits the way we do things already, so we'll stick with that one. And someone else go, well, actually, no, we prefer this. Clearly, they've got to work together. Otherwise, the whole thing's pointless and we might as well not have started in the first place. I mean, it is true that, I think for a lot of our members, for instance, they are very small businesses and their clients tend to be very small businesses. And I think, therefore, we struggle a little with engagement and a little bit of traction because they go, well, they're not worried about it. My clients don't care about this stuff. They don't have to report on anything. Well, they don't now, but it's not far away. It really is coming down the line very, very quickly. And I think that sort of brings to the next point of why bother is it's going to be a benefit. It's naked self-interest, really. This is going to be a commercial benefit to you to know about this stuff. We really do need to shift the conversation. I mean, the regulation is necessary, but we need it to go from a have to a want to. And a lot of driving that want for us is around take people getting more skills so they can supply more services, so they get a wider client base, so they have less risk, and they can make more money. So it ultimately comes down to, and that's where that commercial aspect really comes into its own. And then there's the bit about because it's the right thing to do. Now, this is where I said, there is, I would say, an ethical and a moral imperative here as well. Don't take away from that. And I sometimes get the feeling that people don't want to talk in that way. So they'd rather talk about business, they'd rather talk about commerce, rather talk about how businesses are going to change things, rather than why. Why it's really important and why there's a sort of moral imperative there. And there is an ethical, as professionals, we have ethical codes, and it is about following those rules and codes, and quite often that's about putting the client first. But actually, we need to talk about putting people and planet first. And I think, professional bodies and wider society have a real role to play in enacting the kind of nudge theory. And I know we mentioned earlier about the idea of peer pressure, and that's really important too. And, we as global bodies working together can really start to, say, you're missing out. And then finally, coming on to the last reason, and perhaps probably the most important, is because if you don't keep up, the profession will become irrelevant. And that goes back to that first strand of the AAT strategy, keeping the profession relevant. Well, if we're not engaged in this area, then that's it. The profession's done. I mean, I've worked, in and with a number of different professions. And one of the things that I've seen many times is there are always those who, slightly more entrepreneurial, who will jump on a trend, and they will, if need be, sort of create a new profession. And what that means is people end up doing stuff that more qualified people ought to be doing, and they're not doing it as well. And there's a real danger that this is something that might happen within this space. And the fact that accountancy is not a regulated sector also increases the likelihood of that happening. That's one of the reasons why AAT, for instance, has been running what we're calling our accountable campaign, which is around persuading government that persons offering accountancy services to the public should be qualified and ideally be a member of a professional body. But if these newcomers, if these Johnny-come-latelys are the only option, then what then? And that's why accountants really need to upskill, whether that's through their initial training, whether that's learning by doing, whether it's CPD, whether it's post-qualification training of some sort. That is what they need to be doing, and we need to be doing it now. It's not sometime in the future. It's not when everything becomes regulated. It's now. It's being at the forefront. And if we can do that, and if accountants can get the skills so they can design, they can develop, they can measure, and they can advise, then, if they want to, that's how accountants can save the world. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I think just adding on to Adam at the end there, saying at the end, like the time is now, hence why we are net zero now. There is no time like the present. So I think just to introduce myself, so I'm David. I run our professional services divisions at Net Zero now, and accountancy, I'm proud to say, is definitely probably my proudest sector to be working in. Yeah, the first one that we launched with Adam and Sarah who are in the room, and it's been running for just over a year now. So today I'm really going to talk to you a bit about Net Zero Now and our accountancy initiative, what we've been doing there. And then also what we do on kind of how we differ on our sector by sector approach to working with companies. So I think, we're kind of more along the lines of kind of how PwC were talking. So, we have representatives from industry bodies here, and now we're the companies that are actually kind of directly working with companies to go net zero and calculate their footprints and so on. Now I have a lot more slides, I'm afraid to say. I wish I could talk without many slides, but I have quite a few here. And I think also, luckily, going quite near the end, I know Mark has touched on a few of the things that I wanted to talk about. So it means I will be able to actually reduce the length of this, which I'm sure you'll all be happy to hear. So I think one of the things that we always start with, now we've talked a lot about net zero, and quite often when I do these talks at the very end, everyone says to us, well, we've heard of carbon neutrality, but what do we actually mean by net zero? So just to quickly reiterate, net zero really is all about reductions. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about reducing your impact on the environment. And then really, once you've reduced your impact as much as possible, then only purchasing those carbon credits and looking to offset at the end to offset those residual emissions. So when we work with companies, it's really all about understanding where they currently are, what their impact is, and then what can they do to reduce and improve. Now, what we do that's quite different. So we don't work with every single type of company. Every single company is different. In every sector, if you're a pub or a bar, your sources of emissions are very, very different to an accountant's. In the hospitality sectors, you're dealing with huge amounts of food, huge amounts of waste, transportation of goods, and so on. When you're in accountancy practice, you can afford to be more streamlined. You're dealing with technology, and especially nowadays since COVID, a lot of it being more virtual, you're dealing with people. So luckily for accountants, your footprints are much smaller than those of other industries. But it does mean that we need to start tailoring solutions to fit those specific types of businesses. There isn't as far as we're concerned, a one-size-fits-all policy that works for everybody. And in every industry, behind all of your large companies, there's a huge long tail of SMEs that are looking and will need to at some point get started on the net zero journey. And they need to know what they're doing and how they're going to go about doing it. So what we do is we look at what we call a net zero sector protocol, which very originally is in the accountancy industry is the net zero accountancy protocol. And we work with key industry bodies, and we're really lucky in accountancy to have worked with ICAW, AAT, kind of list all the acronyms, AIA, ACCA and SAGE to develop the protocol in this sector. And we come together and look at exactly what do you need to include in your carbon footprint, what kind of reductions targets do you need to set, and then how do you go about achieving them. And then also we talk about communication and certification so that those who go through the process can talk confidently and be proud of what they've achieved. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that now. So I think one of the first things, just to kind of maybe go into it a bit more detail, is why should we actually do this? We've worked with a lot of SMEs over the last year. And the fact is, a lot of them say to me, we wanted to do something and we wanted to do more without all the public pressure, of course, of their own free will. They want to do something, but they just don't really know where to start. So the sector protocols really is about outlining exactly what they can do. Instead of it being sort of generic guidance, or they can see it as being quite risky, they don't want to be accused of greenwashing, as we've talked about. They can find some of the global guidelines like the greenhouse gas protocol, SBTI, confusing. They don't know how to interpret it. It needs to be simplified. Even though we're talking about accountants being able to save the world, which I absolutely believe they can, and this will definitely fall in an accountant's remit, they have those skills, but what they also need are the tools, and they need to interpret how they're going to use them to be able to kind of put this into their repertoire. And then also historically, going net zero and incorporating this into your business has been extremely expensive. And if you're an SME or a smaller company, you can't afford expensive consultants. So how do we make this accessible to everybody? And so with our protocols and obviously with our platform that Adam mentioned earlier on, we try and make it relevant. So we want to write it in a language that speaks to the sector, and we want to make sure that they understand that it's specifically for them. We want to make it consistent with global standards, so it does incorporate all of the most current and best global guidelines that are out there, and they're constantly changing, so we have to update these on an annual basis. That's also where the credibility comes in, because it is up to those global standards. We want to make it accessible, so that's where the platform comes in, so it takes everything that goes into these protocols and puts it into an easy-to-use system. And then obviously, because it's an online SaaS platform and sort of removing that consultancy aspect of it, it can make it affordable to everybody. Now, of course, we've heard a little bit about, why should businesses want to go net zero? And, as Adam said, obviously, we should do it because it's the right thing to do. But when you're a smaller business, often being able to do the right thing and also balancing the bills that you've got, looking after your staff, can sometimes take the back burner. But as we know, regulations, we've heard a lot about regulations tonight, they're going to be forced upon everybody sooner or later. Everybody is going to have to start reporting on their carbon emissions in the next couple of years, and obviously lots more stuff coming next year. But of course, from our sort of private sector side of things, actually we want to commercially incentivize people to do this. There's a huge amount of evidence out there that actually going net zero will not only save you money, but it will help you if you're looking for investment in your business. We get requests from companies every week looking for PPN reporting, PPN 0621, because they're going for public sector funding bids. There's a huge amount of demand from staff, especially from the younger generation. They want to work for companies that have sustainability plans in place. And so we're seeing that those companies that are putting going net zero and putting sustainability first are able to attract much better staff and also hold on to them for a lot longer. So there's a huge amount of benefits to going net zero, and it's the early adopters who are really going to benefit from that now. When it's forced upon you, I'm afraid you're not going to get a huge amount extra from it. So going actually into some of the sections in the protocol itself. So what this really does quite simply is it outlines exactly how you calculate your carbon footprint, but also what should you include in your carbon footprint itself. And I'll talk about the standardization in a bit. It's really important that everybody starts calculating their footprint in the same way and including the same things, because there's a huge amount of variance. And I think obviously in accountancy, people don't like variance so much. It's important that we start to try and standardize this. We help set targets. There's a lot of information out there, but actually how much do you need to reduce by? And I'll talk about the carbon budget in a minute, which we talked about briefly before. And then also when it comes to reducing, what do we actually need to do and what does that look like? And then I mentioned our certification so that people can easily communicate what they're doing. So this diagram might look familiar. I think Mark might have lifted it from me, but I can't prove anything. So just to really add to this, I won't go into this again. We've heard about scopes 1, 2, and 3 reporting. This is how we categorize your emissions. And it really is scope 3 that is the hardest to quantify. But when we do measure our carbon footprint, obviously there are lots of different types of greenhouse gases, and we don't obviously have separate categories for all of them. We equivalate them to CO2. So each of the different types of emission sources, we will only report them in CO2 equivalent. So the impact of its equivalent in CO2, which is over here. So I won't go into this slide in too much detail. I think we've heard enough about it today so far. But in terms of actually what we do in terms of calculating, so when you look into scope 3 in particular, it's actually separated into 15 different categories. Now, pretty much every company that goes down this path will report on scope 1 and 2 automatically. That is the standard. But scope 3 is extremely challenging. But when you look at what companies are actually reporting, they're reporting on different categories within this, and they're not including absolutely everything. So you're not actually all playing on the same. You're not all playing on the same field. You're not singing from the same hymn sheet. And I'll show you some examples of that with some accountancy firms to make it relevant shortly. So what we try and say in the protocol, and this is obviously very early days, is if you are an accountancy practice in this instance, then you need to include these categories in your scope 3. And by doing that, when you're comparing accountancy firms in this case, you know that you're comparing like for like and things aren't missing. And I think this also will help protect companies. There's a lot of greenwashing claims going on. So by knowing that you're actually all recording on the same things, it will protect you when it comes to talking about what you're doing to the public. Before I give some examples on that, just, everyone here likes numbers. So let's actually talk about how do you actually measure a carbon footprint? What does that look like? And so what you actually use, they're called emissions factors. Quite simply, when you run a business, everything that you purchase, everything that you do has an associated impact on the environment. So whether you're buying a laptop, all the materials have had to be mined. They've all had to be shipped to a facility that's been put together and then it's shipped to you. So there's an impact on those goods. An easy example here is really looking at flying. I'm sure everybody has flown at some point. But as an example, every time you fly 1 mile, fuel is burnt and there's an associated emission from that. So in this example, you have a factor for every passenger mile and the associated CO2. When that goes into our system, it will calculate the footprint. So flying 20,000 miles on a long-haul flight, for example, is the equivalent of producing about 6.215 tons of CO2. And that's really what carbon accounting is. It is taking all of your actions and all of your operations and turning that into a number that is easy to understand, just like accountancy in general. Now, I'm glad that I didn't pick PwC as an example tonight. So let's talk about some of the other large names that everybody knows. So, for example, let's talk about Ernst & Young, one of the largest accountancy practices in the entire world. Now, no surprise, their total footprint is actually, this is just for the UK, I should mention. This is not their global footprint. But even as a total global UK footprint for about 17,000 staff, give or take, their total emissions for 2022 were 34,641 tons, which is huge. It's much bigger than some of the ones that we calculate with our clients. What's interesting is that obviously there was a huge dip over the pandemic of way less than half of their 2020 emissions, but it's obviously shot back up again recently. But what I really want to look at is these companies are very good at reporting. They don't really try and hide anything. But what you see when you look into the details is they actually don't record any of their purchased goods and services at the moment. They only report on paper. And so that came to about 76 tons of this entire total. They don't include capital goods, but that's okay because a lot of that normally is covered by purchased goods and services. And also one huge element that they don't include is employee commuting. And from the work that we do with our clients, that can account for a huge portion of your footprint. We're talking like 10 to 30% depending on how you operate and where you're based. So all of these massive parts are missing from their footprint. When actually you compare it to someone like Grant Thornton, and they have really, really good reporting standards. So they actually do report on all of categories 1 to 14. They make sure they meet a minimum requirement reporting on 67% or capturing 67% of their Scope 3 emissions. And they include all of these items. And then if you look at the sort of how we benchmark and compare these is on per full-time employee. So you can see, you might think, oh, Ernst & Young isn't too bad. It's about 2.35 tons per employee. And obviously Grant Thornton is about half of that. But when you take into account what they're missing, there's a huge amount of something hidden. And I'm not an accountant, I'm afraid. I did engineering. But I think this is almost like hiding revenue from HMRC, right? If HMRC suspected that you were hiding money from them, I'm pretty sure they would come after you. So why should anybody accept anything less from some of these largest companies that are out there? And then actually I did do a bit more research into KPMG, not PwC, again, luckily. But they do report, they have a similar amount of staff in the UK to Ernst & Young, around 17,000. They do report on goods and services, and last year that came to 153,962 tons of CO2. So about 2,000 times what Ernst & Young are reporting on at the moment. So it really puts it into perspective, the kind of scale that we're talking about when it comes to these large companies, and also why it's really important that companies start to actually account and record and report on the same thing so that you're actually comparing apples with apples. So I did want to talk a little bit about some of the companies that we work with. Now, we've been really, really lucky to work with a large range of different size companies. And I just wanted to pick 3 random ones. I'm afraid I couldn't put the last one. We haven't published their data yet, but it's just an example here for you. So looking at sort of a smaller company like Inglis, it's about 8 full-time employees. You can see what becomes quite common with smaller companies is they don't actually have, sometimes it's quite common, they don't have Scope 1 and 2. A lot of it falls into Scope 3. And what we find is Scope 3 will typically, for an SME, take up around 80 to 100% of their emissions that falls into that category. But what's nice to see when we go through these is actually the benchmarking per employee is fairly consistent. And we see that across all of them up to that scale. But as we do work with larger and larger companies, that does go up. So we've got another example jumping on here. We're a company of about 1,000 staff, and their benchmark does go up to about 3.5 tons per employee as you go through. So anyway, what's also been quite exciting over the last year is, we developed our accountancy initiative first because we see this really falling in the hands of accountants. And with the case of RRL, we've been quite lucky. They're now starting to promote this to all of their clients, they're adding this to their armory, and they're helping their clients to go net zero. They're based in Cornwall, which is good. And so they have a lot of hospitality clients, and we have a big hospitality division. But we're starting to really see our accountancy clients starting to work with us more to help their clients, which is great. Now, we talked about the carbon budget a bit. So we've talked about sort of calculating. I wanted to talk about reductions and why it's so important. Obviously we did, we had in 2015 at COP21, the world leaders came together and we signed the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So that really said that everybody now has to take action to keep global warming in check. Now, I think we talked about the carbon budget briefly, but I wanted to put a few numbers around that. So this is based off of 2021 on carbon trackers. So if we want to try and keep global warming to 1.5 degrees max, then we can only actually release about 360 gigatons before we breach that limit and we start to see the impacts of that. So that doesn't mean that actually over the next, I think it's saying 9 years, we're releasing about 41.5 gigatons per year. So we have about 9 years before we reach these targets, give or take. It doesn't mean we have to start acting in 9 years. It means that we need to have reached net zero by then if we want to make sure that we don't see the worst impacts of climate change. And of course, we have different scenarios for the 1.7 degrees and the 2 degrees and so on. Lots of good reasons why we don't want to reach that, because 2 degrees and the impact of 2 degrees is way worse than 1.5 degrees. So we want to try and make sure that we minimize the impact as much as possible. I think a lot of us have already seen the impacts that this has had already. I'm sure we've all experiencing hotter summers, which sounds great. But I think a lot of you might have received a notification from the BBC that they've put out heat warnings for this weekend. We're going to see in excess of 30 degrees, which is unusual even for June. Everyone's heard about, the ice caps melting, sea level is rising. One of the saddest things for me is the fact that our coral reefs are dying. So half the reason I work in this sector is because I love scuba diving and I can see the impacts of that already. And of course, people are already seeing more and more extreme weather events. We're getting hurricanes, tornadoes, forest fires is bringing up more and more frequently. So there really are big impacts, and we need to try and minimize this as much as we can. So how do we do that in our protocols? Going to bring it back to the protocols. So we try and set consistent standards in line with the Science Based Targets Initiative. That is sort of the global standard for reductions targets. So we will make sure that our clients who commit to these targets, they're aiming to reduce their Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% by 2030. They're looking to reduce all of their emissions by 30% over 5 years. And of course, the grand target of reducing by at least 90% by 2050 to be truly net zero, and then offsetting the remainder of that. And then very briefly, outside of that, communication. Now, we want to make sure that accountants and all of our clients have the tools to communicate effectively. And what better than a certification? So if they measure and set their targets in line with the protocol, it means that we can certify them as either on the road to net zero, which is that lovely blue logo you can see. And that just means that they've committed to calculating their footprint annually. They're committing to reduction activities, and they're going to implement and meet those targets that we set. And then when they do actually achieve net zero and reduce by that 90% threshold, and things do change, we hope that that will become easier for SMEs over time, then we can certify them as a full net zero company here. And I think just lastly, we are very, very fortunate to have some excellent partners across all of our sectors. So we're working in hospitality. Across my divisions, we're working with accountancy, tech, law, financial advisors. We also work with L'Oreal, and we're working in the hair and beauty sector. And we're also now in breweries, and we've got lots and lots more of our sectors in the pipeline. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Hello, I'm Sarah Ray. I'm from ICW, and I lead on all of our climate change work. So I'm just going to briefly go through what I'm going to cover. So a bit on what ICW is doing in the sustainability space, differentiating a bit between sustainability, ESG, and climate, the role of accountants and how that's evolving, and then a bit about some of the bits of learning you can do. So our work, I have to correct you a bit, Graham, saying that professional bodies, weren't really looking at this. We actually employed our head of sustainability in 2004. So that was kind of well ahead of the curve in terms of sustainability and accountancy. And we published this really big piece on sustainability in business and what that means for the profession. And I think largely our chief executive has been a key driver of the sustainability agenda at ICW. So we've been in this space a while, but it's kind of grown exponentially in the sort of last 5 years. And I would say the work that we do is sort of split into 3 areas in sustainability. There's part of it is the know-how. So looking at what members need to know about climate and sustainability, whether that's in corporate finance, reporting, financial services, the public sector, audit and assurance, and we deliver different events, articles, insights, guidance, etc. Then we have the policy space, so engaging with government. How do they be more ambitious on climate and sustainability policies, looking at regulation and standards. We do have positions on the UK's Transition Plan Task Force, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in case you don't know what that is. And then the education piece, so the qualification is the ACA, which we do have sustainability embedded throughout the qualification now, and then our further CPD offering. So I like to differentiate when I'm talking to members about what sustainability is and what ESG is, or how I see it is a bit of a difference. Sustainability is quite broad, and the definition that's up in red there came from a 1987 report, which means to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Which again, what does that actually mean? And the UN Sustainable Development Goals kind of helped explain the broad spectrum of sustainability. 17 of the goals looking at poverty, hunger, responsible consumption and production, climate action being a big one. And I see that as very much sort of inside out approach. So sustainability kind of looking at the effects that an entity has on the environment. And then there's ESG, which came about sort of from an investor side of things, which is looking a bit more outside in. So how does climate change and other factors actually impact on enterprise value? And then I've sort of pointed out climate there, being sitting within all of that. But that's kind of been a big focus, I suppose, for businesses lately. I mean, there's been some considerations of social side and governance, but the climate piece has been huge, largely because of net zero targets set by government and other organisations, and a big drive towards that net zero agenda. And just looking at that sort of outside in, inside out approach, we've got these impacts and dependencies. So you'll see business or government, they have impacts on workers' rights, waste, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, etc. And then they're dependent on things like worker health, diversity, climate, regulatory risks, and so on. So trying to have a conversation about climate with businesses can be quite difficult. And I tend to talk about what is the big climate change effects on the economy, because it is quite complex. So I'll give an example of last year we reached temperatures of 40 degrees in the UK, which is really unheard of. We've seen across Europe and Canada and so on. So what were the consequences of that extreme heat event? Well, we had really dry land, which affected farming, leading to food scarcity. There might be increased imports because you need food from elsewhere, which could have driven up inflation. There's higher risks of wildfires. We saw wildfires in the UK, I think, for the first time. We saw really tragic scenes across California, Australia, and the amount of devastation that's caused by that, not just on people, but on businesses and supply chains. And there's a health impact. So, heat kills, not just from fires, but extreme heat in buildings. We're not used to that. And certainly in the UK, most of our buildings don't have air conditioning. It's really poorly insulated and things. So we're just not really set up for it. And also, when it's really hot, does anyone want to work? I find it very difficult to stay focused in a hot office. So that does impact on productivity. So that is a real business implication. And then looking at our infrastructure, we saw railways that were buckling. The rail lines weren't working. There's roads that melt when it gets too hot. So there's those infrastructure issues that impact on people and business. So I won't cover this in too much detail, but here are some of the kind of big climate developments in the last years and what we're going to look forward to in the coming year. So Paris Agreement being a big one. And just to reiterate, this is a limit and not a target, which a lot of businesses see 1.5 degrees as a target. But no, this is a limit for us to be living in a kind of reasonably sound environment. It's going to get uncomfortable, but it would be like the best option. Anything above 1.5 degrees, even by like 0.1 of a degree, is going to be worse and worse and worse. And just in case you aren't aware, that we're currently at about 1.2 degrees. And there was actually a report published recently that we might even reach 1.5 in the next few years. So this was 1.5 by the end of the century. So that's kind of moved up a timeline huge. And if we aren't worried about this, we really should be. So that was the big global target. And fossil fuels was mentioned at the COP26 cover text for the first time ever. ISSB, which I don't know if it's actually been mentioned already. I think it has by a few of you. But the International Sustainability Standards Board, they brought out 2 draft agendas, so one on sustainability, one focused on climate. So this was really tried to make a global baseline for reporting to make it comparable, and that, you know, there is that alphabet soup that was mentioned earlier of these different reporting standards. So thankfully it was built off of the TCFD. So in the UK, TCFD is already mandatory for the largest listed companies. It looks like we're going to adopt ISSB standards in the near future. So there's only a kind of a little bit of additionality in terms of reporting for that. And those are due to be finalised at the end of this month. So I believe during London Climate Action Week, we should have those standards out and start looking at the finalised versions. I did also mention Transition Plan Task Force before. So their remit essentially is to create the gold standard of transition plans. So what does that framework look like? And not only to reach net zero, but making it a just transition, looking at being nature positive. Also, God, what I was saying there. So it's nature positive, just economy wide, that's it. So not just looking at you as a business, but how are you impacting the whole economy while you transition? So the role of chartered accountants and what can they do in terms of tackling climate change? There's quite a lot on there, but the Royal Charter dictates that the role of chartered accountants is to work within the public interest. So there's a huge opportunity there to make accounts much more relevant and accessible to a wider audience thinking about this public interest piece. So what do stakeholders actually want to know? And a key role of accountants is to simplify some really complex information, communicate this with external and internal stakeholders. And the sustainability data is no different. So we have things like reporting, assurance, risk management, looking at sustainability strategies. So they work in so many different areas across different industries and can have a huge impact. One also being if you're working in financial services or investment, then you have an opportunity to make sure that finance and money is flowing into green projects. So I'll briefly touch on this. UN SDGs, again, these are all of the goals, it's quite a lot. But what are accountants good at? Measuring. So the first step to tackling impacts on our planet is to start measuring some of these things. It can be quite tricky with sustainability because, as you can see from the SDGs, it covers a lot of different things. It's not just financial data anymore. So, you know, the tricky part really is that how do we translate some of these goals into measurable, quantifiable outcomes, and kind of then breaking it down to like an entity level, because the goals were meant for sort of national jurisdictions. They weren't designed with businesses in mind. So in financial reporting, we know kind of what this looks like. We have our financial statements. They are revenue, profit. But when you're moving into the financial reporting, it gets a little bit tricky. ESG reporting is areas of some kind of easy to quantify in the sense of gender pay gap. You kind of know what you're looking and measuring at. But when you're looking at carbon footprint, for example, what is a good footprint? What's bad? Is it average? So you need to sort of look at not just what you're doing, but externally and measuring against other people and their performance. So a good starting point is to be really clear on what your aim is. There's no point in measuring something if we're not actually going to do anything about it, which I find, unfortunately, a lot of the reports that people are posting on around sustainability is just, we did this thing, but then they don't do anything else, so there's no progress. So be clear about your aim. What are you trying to achieve? Does it fit with the strategy of your organization? If it doesn't, then why are you measuring it in the first place? And then setting targets and making it a bit more granular in defining some of these like specific goals and objectives, then quantifying it very specifically on what does success look like. And then, of course, start measuring these things and reporting progress. So reporting should be the last thing you do. You shouldn't be starting with the reports and then hoping that we'll start achieving things just because we've written it down and published it in a nice little glossy brochure. We actually did hold a webinar on looking at ESG reporting and linking it to the SDGs. So if you search that, it'll come up through our data analytics community. I'll not go through this because many of you have already spoken about the scope 1, 2, 3. But just to reiterate, yep, scope 3 is a big one and also is the most difficult to measure. But most advice I give to people is just get going with it. And you have wonderful companies like Net Zero Now who can help you through that process. And at the moment, actually, so in terms of measuring and publishing carbon emissions, as well as in terms of sustainability, emissions is the one area that has kind of the strongest legal footing, in that there are a few different frameworks and things depending on the size of your organisation, whether you need to publish your emissions. And therefore, although a lot of the larger organisations are being regulated for this and asked for this data, those in the supply chain are also being asked for that. So small organisations have to start doing this one way or another. So looking at our educational offering, we launched this course in March of this year. This is a Fundamentals of Sustainability program, which is designed for accounting students, currently at undergraduate or postgraduate level. The idea behind this course is really looking at a sort of introduction to sustainability and starting to make those linkages between sustainability and the accounting profession. This is a free course. It was designed for students to take themselves or to fit into your accounting modules at university. So although it is designed to be self-taught, we do also have a toolkit for lecturers. So if you wanted to integrate this into a classroom setting, there is an opportunity to do that. And the course takes about 8 to 10 hours. There isn't kind of additional reading added into it, but there is kind of different links that you can go off to make the course a bit longer if you so wish. And I mentioned earlier, the ACA qualification does have sustainability embedded throughout it now, but if you completed it, say, 10, 15 years ago, there was bits of sustainability, but not a huge amount. So last year, we launched the sustainability certificate in August, September time. And that was really aimed for those who qualified 10 plus years ago, who really need to understand more about sustainability. This is very much an introductory level. So how do you start looking at sustainability performance, metrics, targets, risk management? How does this fit into your financial planning and analysis? And that's approximately 11 hours, 12 hours plus a case study. And it's been really popular so far. So popular, in fact, that we are developing 2 new sustainability certificates. So one is for the public sector, specifically for the central government finance function, but there will also be a sort of area of that for local authorities too. And we're in the middle of the pilot for that at the moment. So hopefully that'll be launched in autumn time this year. And then we'll be doing one also for non-executive directors. And finally, some sort of informal training, learning. We have our sustainability and climate change community. That's free to join. You don't even have to be an ICW member to join that. It's open to anyone. We have articles and insights, all things that are relevant to the profession. Some of it is a bit technical, some is not. It's just kind of keeping you up to date on what's happening. We have a newsletter that goes out every other month, advertising events and articles and things. Our biggest event of the year is our Climate Summit, which is a virtual 5-day event that we hold this year. It's in November, so covering lots of different topics. So just transition. We're doing sessions on financing the transition, a bit about how do you calculate your carbon footprint in SBTI and all those sorts of things. And we'll have a day on energy, looking at supply side, demand side constraints and things like that. So I think that's everything from me. Thank you.
So, has anyone got any questions? No questions at all? Everyone happy with the environment?
Yeah, I've got a question. The local government chap with the multi-accountancy qualification. Yeah.
That'd be Mark, yeah. He's allowed to have all that. He's allowed to have all that, yeah?
I didn't say anything. Just be remembering what I remember then, I'm sorry. You said something about carbon offsets. I'm sort of new to all this, so excuse me if it's not you pitching English.
No.
But you said that purchasing carbon offsets was slightly cheating the system. Well, I had to do some research into all of this recently, and I started with the principle, as some students present, follow the money. So Microsoft have put together a £1 billion fund for offset. Purchasing the offsets. 6 months later, it's about 2 or 3. 6 months later, Google followed with a £2 billion fund. Microsoft have already allocated about 600 million of the billion, and they're pretty transparent about where it's spent. There's a very good report online about where they spend the money, what they're spending the money in. Now, most of that is in high science, very technical projects, very lot of chemists, scientists, etc. Surely, can you not see the advantage of them funding projects like that, which wouldn't be funded by the public sector? And I know you're saying they're jumping a little bit in terms of maybe they should be creating those carbon reductions within their own work environment, but they are funding £600 million or $1 billion worth of high science projects.
So I think you are referring to the supply side in terms of creating new offsets, and that's fantastic. I was talking more about the demand side in terms of we can't get to net zero, let's go and buy an existing offset. And as with anything, there's a finite amount of existing offsets, so if one person buys it, somebody else can't. So it's great that those big global organisations are creating more offsets. UK government obviously also doing the same as well. So yeah, I think you're referring to the supply side, which is...
Well, I'm referring to the fact that they're investing £600 million now into high science projects, employing people at high salaries to do very cutting edge economic...
No, as I said, it's great because they're creating more supply. Mine's more about, finite pot. And if one person buys it, the other person can't buy it. So it's the demand side I was referring to. So.
I mean, it's great. I think that if they're investing that money, it's fantastic. If that gives us new technical solutions, it's brilliant. But there's no point in doing that if you're causing the problem in the first place. I think that's where the issue lies, is that they're an enormous global thing. Their footprint is so huge. That's why they're offsetting. Now, it would be nice if they did both. Now, if they should have really strict targets to try and reduce their footprint, as well as investing the money that they can in trying to improve the environment. So, I think the problem Mark was referring to is people doing nothing and just spending money to say, look, we've offset, so we don't have to do anything else. We don't have to.
But they're employing thousands and thousands and thousands of people as well on very high salaries. So I don't see part of the problem as being. I think that's a bit sort of. I don't have a problem with big tech myself. You sound slightly like
No, I saw just them. I mean, there are many other examples that you could use, which would include, fossil fuel companies doing exactly the same thing. They will tell you how much they are investing in research and technology and offsetting, but actually they're one of the major contributors in the first place. So what they should really be doing is looking to reduce first, as well as doing it. And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but he was saying that the two need to go hand in hand. You can't. There's no point in just doing nothing except spending money on offsets. Whereas I think actually big tech companies are generally speaking doing both. They are trying to reduce their.
This is also research that the government probably wouldn't fund, so private sector, and also arguably scientists create more than accountants.
No, I agree. It's a great question. I've got an issue about the companies deciding what they think is good and what they don't think is bad. They could spend their money equally making employment in other areas. But it's about them saying to us that they're doing good. And I think we need to start regulating them and tell them where we think they should be spending their money. I think it's quite difficult. And, it's a capitalist society we live in, so it's quite interesting if you have that argument. It's our world that we're going to be left with. It's a great question, though. Thank you.
Just to join in a bit.
Yeah, please do.
But I think there's also an area here between the sort of science-based targets and the offsetting. So, in a sense, as you said, I think correctly, the offsetting is the sort of the residual part that you can't get rid of with the science sort of.
I think we've all got a problem with the offsetting, haven't we? But then if you produce, sort of millions of cars a year, how are you going to offset that? It's impossible, isn't it?
But I think the problem is not that they're not funding, say, new offsets, but the problem is to find a way to standardize how we account for them, how we measure them, if they're doubly spent. There's all sorts of problems which are not really addressed by the market as it exists today.
I tried to answer earlier.
So, Sarah, would you like to try and...
Yeah.
What do you think?
So with SBTI, I think it's 90% you're supposed to reduce and then offset. But a lot of companies want to kind of see to be doing a bit more and say, oh, well, I don't want to wait until I've got my 90%, let's offset. And I see the kind of benefits of buying an offset, but an offset itself inherently is not bad. It's when the market it's a voluntary market, it's not regulated. Yeah. And then, like we saw with Vera, turns out a lot of their offsets weren't doing what they said they were doing, which is the issue. Companies like Microsoft investing lots of money in these new technologies, absolutely fantastic, because we will not reach net zero if we haven't invested in these sorts of projects. It is just the reputation of carbon offsets that has been tainted because it hasn't been regulated, it's not verified as such. But I think it's great if these large companies should be investing money in these projects as well as decarbonising their own operations at the same time.
Anyone else on the panel like to add to that? Or
yeah, all I was going to say was, obviously a lot of this has come from, there was that Guardian article that came out was a couple of months ago, and in my call that I have with the people that we work with, they always ask about carbon credits now. They want to know, and I think a lot of people see it as kind of black and white. It's like, well, now they're bad, and at some point they're going to be good again. And it's quite dangerous because actually they are a really useful tool, right? They're one of the main mechanisms we have for trying to counteract the impact that we all have in our daily life, not just businesses. I think someone mentioned we have to look at ourselves here too. Like, we are also causing, emissions of damage, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's not a black and white topic. Actually they are a really good mechanism, and we used to work with a lot of clients that said, well, actually we're going to reduce and we're going to implement all these plans and we're going to offset because we want to do more and we want to look at local projects. And now since the article, all they're saying is, oh no, we want to avoid offsets now because we don't want to be accused of greenwashing. And it's like, actually it doesn't go hand in hand, it's not the same thing. So I think we've got to be quite careful about looking at it in that kind of light.
Okay, have we got any of the students here today got a question? No. What? You happy with the world as it is? No, that's good. We might have to go back to the academics then, I'm afraid. I think that for a lot of people, the issue about carbon trading is it's like Bitcoin. It's like everyone starts viewing it as people are trying to manipulate it and manipulate the way that they are viewed in the world. That sort of greenwashing idea. And the big companies can look like they're doing good stuff, but you always wonder what they're trying to hide or why are they so keen. Someone like, for you at PwC, I mean, you must go into organisations and they must be asking you to look at what they do. I mean, can you just explain to maybe for some of the students, so on a day that, you're going, what do you actually do? It's always quite interesting. What do accountants actually do? So what would you do as, sort of you're going into quite a big company, what are they asking you to look at and what sort of insights do you try to give them?
Good question. It all depends on the maturity of the clients that we're looking at. If it's a mature client and they already have a sustainability department, they're aware of the non-financial metrics that are material to them that they have to report on. And it's primarily coming from the regulatory requirements. But if it's a smaller company, then they might ask questions that are more fundamental questions that they want to know about. So it all depends on the client. But what we usually do is, instead of looking at all the financial statements and balance sheet, income statements, we're looking at anything else in their reporting that they might be impacting the climate. Looking at their climate impact, greenhouse gas emissions, from environmental perspective. From social perspective, we're also looking at their gender parity or the metrics such as the female executive percentage. We're also looking at their governance metrics, how they are measuring, how they are looking into answer the upcoming reporting requirements. So those are the things that we are looking at. And most of our clients are actually really in need of our support because they're because of the various standards that are still coming and that are not certain yet. So we're advising them as to where they can start from.
So it's getting ready because people have to report on this stuff already, don't they? You have to report on your sustainability, don't you? Is that right? In your annual reports, the big companies?
The big listed companies, yes. Although I think there's going to be a consultation review towards the end of this year whether the biggest private companies now need to report, and so I think that's likely going to happen probably next year. And that means through sort of supply chains, through the private companies as well, there'll be more and more people will be asked for this sustainability information. So whether you're hit directly or indirectly, I guess the pool is getting bigger.
Yeah.
But I think that's the other driver, isn't it? For supply chains, it's it will go down the line. You might be quite a small company supplying to a large one. Well, you need to get your house in order, even if you're not required to, because otherwise they're not going to contract with you anymore.
It's that scope 3. Everyone needs to know about scope 3, don't they? The one thing you take away from this is scope 3. It's fantastic, isn't it? So there's
talked about the fact that if you want access to the 300, you need to be talking about this now, so that's a market driver. I've got a view that the sustainability reporting has actually gone backwards because there was a time when there was a lot more in accounts. It's gone backwards. But obviously CIPFA and others are working in the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board to improve that. But as we've said all along, the reporting is very interesting, but what are you actually going to do to improve it? And obviously my area is more about the programs and the projects and how we finance them, the commercial models. And the business cases, what's the decision-making framework in which you make those trade-off decisions?
Yeah, if it just becomes a tick box exercise, it's not going to work for anyone, is it? Not going to work for us and future generations. Sorry, there was a hand up.
Yes, I have to expand on the point that we made. We know that the listed companies, which are listed on the stock exchange, must report on scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 3 is still not compulsory. It's up to them. And as you can see, the companies, I believe, try to legitimize their operations through Scope 3. We have seen 2 examples. So one company is reporting 67% on the Scope 3 metrics, the other company is reporting only 1 or 2.
Well, less. I don't know exactly how much, but yeah.
I think it was nil, wasn't it?
Not a lot.
They try to legitimize the Scope 3 because we know that the regulations are quite relaxed on Scope 3. And of course, for small companies, are not, it's not compulsory for them to report. So it's only listed companies, which are Scope 1 and Scope 2. And again, if we want to see how many listed companies there are compared to small and medium enterprises, then automatically the gap is huge. So maybe do we capture only a small proportion of what is out there in the first place? And on top of that, through Scope 3, there is a thing that the companies try to legitimize their operations. What is your experience?
Who would like to go first on that one? Well, David. David, you can
talk a little bit. I think right now, I think one key thing to say is that in terms of carbon accounting, and obviously there are gaps, is kind of what you're saying, right? So how do we make sure that we capture everything? So I think this is really infant industry in terms of carbon accounting. I mean, it actually hasn't been around for too long, and just the science and the technology behind that to make it accurate is still building and it's still growing. Like if you look at, I talked about emissions factors, they're not perfect. They are sort of a best estimate tool that we can use. But then equally, if you compare it to the transition and the development of accountancy since the early 19th century, I want to say, something like that, standards, technology and everything else changes over time and things get better and better and better. So we're kind of basically trying to say, well, we've been looking at this for the last decade or so. Why isn't it perfect already? And it's because actually this is all still relatively new to us. So, and one thing that we do to counteract that is that double counting and sometimes triple counting is really, really common in carbon accounting. So an example, we talked about supply chain emissions. So we work with a tech company recently that supplies to Apple, and they have to start reporting in order to be able to work for Apple. But every time that they purchase goods from Apple, they are reporting on that technology and on those products. But equally, Apple is already reporting on manufacturing and developing those products in the first place. So we're actually covering it twice because we know that the science is not exact. So there are things in place to help counteract that, but it will only get better as we progress and go on, and as more and more companies are forced to report on this because there's more interest for people to make this more precise, I guess.
Right, so we're going to... Sorry, Mark, go on, please.
3 quick reflections. Firstly, I crunched the numbers for National Highways in terms of their sort of carbon footprint, and that's quite an involved task because it's a massive organisation. For me, you won't be surprised to hear that it's not about the reporting so much as the decision making. And I, as part of training business cases, worked with some public bodies. One of the recent ones was we had to use the money or we'd lose it, so we made the decision to buy some personal computers close to the year end a few years ago. Those personal computers sat in a cupboard for 3 years and went in a skip. But they achieved the spend the money bit. That's why sustainability has to be included in decision making. Equally with Glasgow, they've demolished 18,000 flats, I think, when they did the stock transfer about 20 years ago. And that was the right answer at that point in time. But these days, when you take on board embodied carbon and the carbon created by demolishing and rebuilding, I hope you come up with a very different decision-making answer and not demolish 18,000 flats and rebuild. And again, that's the broader sustainability story because there's obviously much wider implications in terms of, intergenerational fairness, social value. It's not just climate in terms of those 18,000 flats. There's wider sustainability implications as Sarah defines sustainability.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask one more question.
I'll keep it quick. In the post-COVID era, there are quite a lot of organisations who have sought to, improve their optics by encouraging remote working, downsizing, like AAT did, as you explained. But this has implications as well. I mean, that might be really great for their optics in the short term. But sustainability longer term, where's that going?
Well, perhaps I'll let Adam answer.
And I accept that entirely. And one of the first things we talked about was, well, what does that mean in terms of people working at home? We're still, ultimately we're responsible for that because we're employing them and we're telling them to work from home because you can't all come to the office. You haven't got enough room. It's not even a choice really. It's a case of you come in a couple of days a week because if everyone came in at the same time, we wouldn't be able to do it. Although interestingly, I was convinced that we would have more demand last winter because of fuel prices. And everyone wanted to come into the office so they didn't have to heat their homes, but actually that didn't quite turn out like that. But I mean, remote working generally obviously has lots of issues, not just sustainability issues. There are things about how your governance works, how your companies are run, how decisions get made, how networks created, how people learn. We all talk about the fact that, certainly from myself, 90% of what I've learned through my career has been through osmosis. It's from listening to other people. It's not from having been trained in anything particularly.
Sure, I get all of that. I mean,
Sorry.
my question was more about, you've downsized this year, so your figures look great for this year in terms of your carbon emissions, your output, all of that. So in the longer term,
I'm working on the assumption. Already, I'm working on the assumption. When we start,
not just AAT, but other
organisations. No, as I mentioned, the fact that we start using the net zero platform. I'm pretty convinced that once we start drilling down into it a bit more, we're going to see it reverse. We're actually not going to be as good as we thought we were. And I'm prepared for that.
Yeah.
And I've told my colleagues that they need to be prepared for that because, whilst what we're measuring now looks better, I think actually when we start drilling down to it, it's not going to look as good. That just means that we have to have more ambitious targets and we have to think more carefully about what do we do next, what's our next action in this area. So that perhaps the reporting bit, if we don't measure it properly, we can't make those, the secondary bit that everyone's alluding to. There's no point just reporting it if you don't then have a plan to do something about it.
Yeah, you can't control, you can't measure, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, right. I did say sorry everyone. I did say that was going to be the last question, but I'm going to have one more question from the gentleman, the gentleman in the blue that asked. Go on. Well, the thing is, we can all just go outside, and you've got them all night. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. You've been booked all night. But just one more question, and then we will.
So what I wanted to ask was, it's quite a private sector heavy selection of speakers, I would say. And you talked a lot about private companies voluntarily reducing emissions for reputational reasons. I think if you look at lots of environmental success stories that we've had, like for example, stopping harming the ozone layer and I don't know, one I've forgotten now. It's really driven by public sector or government banning things or mandating things. What do you think about the interaction between those two?
That's a great question to end with. Can governments actually change and save the world as well? What with the accountants? I'm gonna. Adam, would be great.
I was going to sort of say something about this, and it's something I spoke to Martin before. We at AAT, for instance, we've been badgering government for a long time to say, well, as part of any decision making you do, whenever you're consulting on new legislation, etc., where is the reference to our net zero targets? Where is the requirement, to compare this against that legal requirement that you have put in place? If that was done on every single occasion, I suspect it would end up in some of that. So actually, no, we can't implement that, or we should be stopping that in order to meet that. So I do think that, that freedom of choice has to be restricted to a certain extent. We can't keep consuming
Sarah,
in the same way.
You've got...
Yeah, well, there's that sort of carrot and stick approach, and clearly, government has failed for a long time to put the right policies in place, but also business has failed too because we've gotten ourselves in this situation. So it has to be both. The market will not kind of solve this itself, and so government has to kind of give it the tools and have the whole picture really to say this is where we want to be. And they've set a target but haven't put enough policy in place to actually reach that. So we need to fill that gap and then give businesses, particularly the smaller businesses, because they make up the majority of the economy, the right tools to be able to achieve this. So it has to be both.
Yeah.
What I want to say is most of our clients, you have to understand, reporting sustainability, reporting non-financial information requires a lot of financing and cost. So most of our clients want to do the bare minimum, and I'm not saying that this is the right thing to do, but I think it is a very good start. And I think what governments are trying to do right now with pushing these reporting requirements is a good start, it's a good push. And so that's why I think it is important that we have that comment, at least for the starting point.
Do you want to say something, Terry?
I mean, I think
I'm going to leave you last.
Yeah. I mean, I think really I was just going to agree that we do need more government intervention on it. And I think luckily for us, I mean, we're not dealing with some of those probably the larger scale companies like PwC, but I guess we're seeing the early adopters. So they're the ones who actually do want to do it for the right reasons, because I mean they're having to still pay from their much smaller pot of cash that they have to do this. So they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. We do get some that come through because they have to, because they're part of a supply chain, and some that want to do it to do that. But I think what I was going to say was, in terms of, we're talking about individuals, and so actually when they're all just looking at themselves, so they can't really see it quite from the big perspective that we need to as a country. I mean, I was working with, I won't name the company, but they've done their first year's footprint with us. They've set their targets, they're certified, and they've done a huge amount of work with it. They've talked to all of their staff. It's a larger company. And then I got a call from them a few weeks ago saying, so we've put these strategies in place, and our partners would like to know if they can hold their conference in Portugal this year. And I was like, I mean, I'm not going to tell you yes or no on this, but I think that actually after all this effort, then actually some things need to change. So I think people just don't quite understand still the impact it can have. So I think there has to be something coming through higher up on it.
And Mark, I'm going to leave you with the last word.
So I tend to be glass half full. There's loads coming through, and obviously I've talked about some of the projects I've been involved in. There's loads of projects happening. The trick is obviously collaborative working, aligned incentives. Government need to understand incentives, and it's that agenda around the fact there's jobs here, there's money to be made here as well. So a lot of the stuff they pushed out recently around sort of green economy and green-led recovery. I think that's the place to sort of the government to nudge along the market failure that I talked about. I don't think they can't solve it all themselves. They need to nudge along and work collaboratively. But there's lots of good things happening, and I just still believe that we're very good at being adaptable, and we will progress it. So I want to, leave with that message rather than it's all doom and gloom.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. That's our third. I'd like to thank the panel. If you could just thank the panel again for their contribution. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Shani, and everyone at Queen Mary, particularly Stuart, for all his work tonight. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Shani. Thanks to all our sponsors. Thank you, and thank you for coming. The film will be available after we all come back from holiday. Obviously, I'm flying out somewhere, but I'm not going to tell you where. Obviously, I'm going to offset that against something, I don't know, a slurry pit somewhere. I just don't know what I'm going to have to work out in tons how many that is. But I do produce a magazine online rather than a paper product now. So I must be saving myself lots of money and I have lots of credit. Thank you, everyone. I think there's still some drink outside. If you want to stay and chat, we've got the